Hello, my name is Charles Bedord. So, my guest today is sitting here and dressed in a Los Angeles Dodger blue uniform, sitting in a Bay Area studio, and you say, why is that? Especially when the Giants are in the playoffs. Well, stay tuned and find out as we explore the active and exciting world of Senior League Baseball.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
As the baby boom generation and earlier generations grow older, we seek ways to stay active and be involved in the sports that we enjoyed as kids. One of these sports, baseball, is being enjoyed by seniors right here in the Bay Area and throughout the state, both in organized local leagues and fantasy camps that you may have heard of. Our guest today is Walt Benston, who plays baseball aimed at senior league players. Let's find out about the opportunities for playing our national pastime well into our later years. Welcome, Walter.
Good to be here.
Let's get to know you a bit. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and some of your earliest memories of baseball.
Well, I grew up in the Poughkeepsie, New York area near the Hudson River. And it was in a small town, 600 people, and enjoyed very much the opportunity in a small town to go to the ball field with my Uncle Fred. And he and I used to play ball with each other at an age of 8 to 12 years old, and that was my first liking for baseball.
So this was just you and your uncle playing. This was just you and your uncle playing together.
That's right. And then when I would go home, radio was a big thing then, and I grew up in the late 30s and early 40s, and lo and behold, Red Barber used to broadcast the Brooklyn Dodger baseball.
Oh, I remember him, sure.
And Red was, of course, extremely partial to the Dodgers, and so I became partial to the Dodgers. So that was the beginning of baseball for me.
Now you have some sons, and how many sons do you have?
Actually, I have 4 sons, 3 of whom play baseball, and
I see.
One of the thrills we've had is he played in college, and of course I was a generation ahead of him, but being in good shape, we were able to play on the same team together for a few years, as I was at the end of my career and he was out of college and starting a career of his own.
Do your sons pitch, or are they catchers, or what positions?
Well, the oldest son is kind of versatile. What we've been trying to do is find a position in the field where he can play, because he's a very good hitter. So we've been moving him around when he was in the time where he was playing very well. He's a very good ball player, right?
I see. Could you talk a little bit about how senior league baseball, quote unquote, is structured?
Yes, I'd be glad to. There's basically 2 kinds of senior league baseball today. Kind of in the old days, going back 30 or 40 years, when Little League started and so forth, during that era we had what would commonly be called town teams, or quote semi-pro teams, and these were pretty much localized. And so what has happened, as with most things as we've gone into the modern era, there's now been a national organization, and it's called Men's Senior Baseball League, MSBL, and it's headquartered in Long Island. And what they have done throughout the country is added memberships that are close to 50,000 members and many, many teams. So what used to be old town teams now are under the umbrella of this Men's Senior Baseball League. And here in the Bay Area, there's a Bay Area. It's the Bay Area Men's Senior Baseball League, and they are affiliated with a national organization. And here in the Bay Area, currently there are 3 leagues functioning. There's over 25, over 35, and over 45.
I see.
And this is the first difference between baseball today for seniors and baseball in the old days, where age wasn't really a consideration, and you played as long as you could play and be good enough to play. But now, by segregating it by age, it gives players an opportunity who are older and perhaps limited to play with people roughly their own age.
I see.
Personally, I have always considered seniors to be at least 40, and when I get into a league where we talk about seniors starting at 25, it kind of makes me wonder.
Well, I know I always wonder when it's a common definition that a senior starts at age 50. And speaking personally, 50 doesn't seem to be very old to me, but I guess it's all a matter of perspective. Now, these teams and these age groups play right here in the Bay Area, I take it?
Yes, they do. I'm not personally aware, since I've not participated in a Bay Area team
Right.
myself. When we get to another kind of baseball, I've been much more involved. But there are basically, as I understand it, 3 leagues, 1, 25, 35, and 45, and there's 6 to 8 teams in each league. So there's roughly 20 teams that are operating throughout the Bay Area that do adhere to the rules that are set by the Men's Senior Baseball League.
Now,
And
just to clarify for our audience, when we use the term baseball, we are referring to traditional hardball baseball. We're not talking about softball.
that's correct, and that is a common misconception. Once you start talking seniors, softball immediately comes up. No, this
Right.
is legitimate baseball, and as a matter of fact, one of the challenges of the Men's Senior Baseball League is that it still plays basically regular baseball rules, which would include such things as stealing and things of that type too. So therefore, not only is it competitive, but you do have to have the kind of ability which is going to allow you to compete in a league of that type. And there are many, I would even like to include myself back a few years, that can still play, certainly at ages of 40 and 50 and even 60.
So then there is no special rules for senior league baseball as far as, or do you have rules, for instance, pinch runners, or you already covered stealing bases as perfectly allowed, but are there any special rules to protect the players from physical injury?
Yes, yes, there are, and not as much in the regular men's senior baseball league as there will be when I talk about the fantasy camp leagues, which we'll get to.
Okay.
But there is safety and also sportsmanship are considered, and certainly while there is a competitive spirit, I know all of the leagues would like to think that they operate with certainly safety in mind.
I see. So what are the skill levels of senior league players? I know it's hard to put them in general category, but let's say compared to major or minor league players in professional baseball, what are the skill levels like?
Well, generally speaking, they'd be much lower.
Right.
However, I would quickly add that in the men's senior baseball league, there are some old-time pros, and when I talk more about the tournaments that do exist, there are some notable major league players who play in some of the major tournaments around the country as part of the men's senior baseball league. Now, no one that's, of course, under a professional contract is eligible,
Right.
but the caliber of play I still would consider, for the most part, to be fair or fair to good for these leagues, and certainly they can't compare, except for an exception or two, to even any sort of minor league
Right.
baseball at all.
Now, do you need to try out for the teams?
On the men's senior baseball league, that's often the case, although an alternative would be, since they're sponsored frequently by companies or other organizations, it may be also a question of who you know, because I think once these teams get established, I think there are many people who continue to play on the same team. So I think, unlike the fantasy camps, where generally abilities are spread out and people acknowledge the fact that we aren't trying to get all the good players on one team or
Right.
trying to win. That's not the case in the men's senior league, and I have played in the National Senior World Series in the men's senior league, and I played when I was in my late 60s, and I could no longer compete when I got in the 70s because of the competitive nature of it.
Now, are you still catching, or what do you play now?
Well, even at the age of 80 a month ago, I played in Stockton. And what was there was a fantasy camp type tournament
Mm-hmm.
because all of the major league clubs on the West Coast have fantasy camps. And I'm now getting into the second type of senior baseball. Now, at these fantasy camps, which cost a considerable amount of money, we can
Mm-hmm.
talk about that in a minute, to come one time. But if you become an alumni of a major league fantasy camp, you're eligible to play in basically Sunday leagues made up of players like yourself, and both Los Angeles and San Francisco have such leagues. And so about 6 times each year, every other month, so to speak, we have a tournament on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in which teams from the Sunday leagues play in minor league ballparks like
I see. That's
Stockton.
interesting.
So now I've kind of pulled together for you what happened in Stockton a month ago, where we had a Dodgers, Giants, Athletics, and Padres all came on Friday, and we played 3 games over the weekend, and the key was the camaraderie. Yes, we wanted to win, but the age groups, while it's technically over 30,
Mm-hmm.
the ages really extend, with most of the players being in their 50s, give or take 10 years.
Oftentimes on the radio, for instance, you'll hear the Giants advertising, and they'll say, "Come down to Phoenix or
Scottsdale.
Scottsdale." It is okay, and join the fantasy camp for the San Francisco Giants. Now, can you tell us a little about these fantasy camps? How do you get involved with these, and what type of environment is it? Is it a kind of, do you have to do a lot of practicing at these camps? Is it a hard workout, or is it mainly a social event? Can you talk a little bit about the atmosphere and environment around fantasy camp baseball?
Sure, I'd be glad to, because I have been to 40 fantasy
40,
camps.
wow.
And the reason is that way back, my wife passed away in the 1980s, and I was 57 years old. And to start the fantasy camp conversation we're going to have, I have played myself now nearly 350 baseball games since I was 57 years old, and more than 200 I have played in fantasy camp environments.
Great.
And the relaxation and the camaraderie is the major thing. And if you go to a fantasy camp, yes, we have people who are very competitive, but the overriding thought is we're going to have fun. And we see a combination of professional people as well as people who work in various kinds of professions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's wonderful to see them in one place, to enjoy a week away. Frequently, the wives of the players have sent their husbands to these fantasy camps, probably to get them away from home. But
Hey,
at any rate, they do enjoy it.
That's interesting, but I bet some of the wives accompany them too and hang out around the Phoenix area and enjoy the sun and so on.
Yes, they certainly do. One of the advantages at Vero Beach, Florida, is where the Dodgers had their camps for many, many years, is that the rooms are also on site, unlike most fantasy camps where they get transported to hotels. But the format of the fantasy camps are the following. It's certainly very little practice and a lot of instruction. And the key is about 80 to 100 normally attend a fantasy camp, and you're divided up into 6 teams. And the people who have been around for a while, I was one of the several people who helped choose the teams, because normally we get maybe 1/3 to 1/2 veterans who are back for their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, or 5th fantasy camps, plus half are new campers. So we try to get 6 teams equally in ability, with a pitcher, a catcher, shortstop, center fielder on every team. And then we have an intramural program where we play we play 1 game in the morning or afternoon of each of 4 or 5 days.
Yes.
And then we have instruction from what are major league coaches, former players, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people come to the fantasy camps, to see their favorite major league ball player,
So
hopefully
you actually
appear.
get to interact then. Let's say I'm just going to use these San Francisco Giants since they're local as an
Surely.
example, but you would get a chance to interact with some of the players. Do you interact with the training staff and so on?
Absolutely.
Do
And
you
I
use the
would,
locker rooms?
yes, yes, we actually use the same locker rooms that the major leaguers use
Oh,
in
that would
spring
be
training.
interesting.
In fact, we get our names up on the lockers
That's great.
ahead of time. I
No-
should say that since I go back to the Brooklyn Dodgers,
Uh-huh.
because of my age and my interest in the Dodgers, very good friends of mine are Duke Snyder and Carl Erskine and Ralph Branca and Clem Labine, who passed away last year. But there are 4 of the 8 remaining members of the Brooklyn Dodger dynasty back in the 50s. And of course, the camaraderie we have with them, all the campers, is wonderful.
Now, you mentioned the wives. I've got to ask you this for my sake of interest. Is there fantasy baseball or is there senior league baseball for women in the Bay Area?
Not to my knowledge at this time, although I would say that at the fantasy camps, women are invited, and we have had women participate at the fantasy camps, and they continue to show promise
Right.
in terms of they add dimension to the fantasy camps, and we've had several very skilled gals as well as gals like the men who are not as skilled but really enjoy the camaraderie and the social aspect.
Well, I
of
had
the
to
camps
ask you
too.
because I know, for instance, women's softball is tremendously popular, and you see it on television, and you hear people talk about it. So I was just wondering about traditional hardball baseball, if there was an opportunity for women to play. And it sounds like if they want to get involved in fantasy camps, they could then.
Well, certainly the fantasy camp would be the place because we do have very liberal rules, and you mentioned earlier about rules that depart from regular baseball rules,
Right.
and that is true for the fantasy camps. For example, there is no stealing, and in addition to that, even, quote, wild pitches, runners normally can't advance only under
see.
certain circumstances.
I see.
And we're also allowed courtesy runners, which
Uh-huh.
is if players can't participate. And probably the best rule, which has attracted people who really do want to play, is that everybody who's on a team, and we normally have 12 to 14 members on a team, everyone must bat in the batting order regardless
Okay.
of whether they play in the field or not.
So nobody just sits on the sidelines.
Correct. And everyone should play half of the innings in the field at some position.
I see.
So everyone is involved, and we have virtually no one who is just, quote, a bench sitter.
Now, I know you talked about interaction with the Giants coaches and players. I noticed that you have a very special bat here, and signed by no other than Dusty Baker, who has strong connections to both the Dodgers and the Giants.
Yes.
And we can talk about that. And you also have an award over here, a pitching award, which we can discuss. Can you just tell us briefly how you got the bat, perhaps, and a little bit of background on the pitching award?
Surely. In 1991, when I was 61 years old, following the 6 games that are played during the week, there's a, quote, all-star game, so to speak, in which the campers, all of the campers, get to play against the instructors.
Uh-huh.
So we have had many different kinds of games like that. And in 1991, when I played, we played against a team made up of the instructors, which included Dusty Baker. I can't remember specifically who else, but it could have been people like Bill Russell, Davey Lopes, Maury Wills,
Okay.
and we could have had people like that playing against us.
These
who
are
were
common household names.
Yes,
Yes.
against the campers. And what happened, I had an opportunity to pitch the first couple innings of that game at the age of 61 and didn't do too badly, and then I wound up catching a bit. But at the end of the game, since I also wound up sliding into a couple of bases and having a collision at home plate, Dusty Baker came up to me after the game and he asked somebody for a magic marker. And he had used this bat in the game. And he said on the bat, "You're an inspiration to us all. Continued health and strength. You're my MVP." And he signed his name, Dusty Baker.
Can you tell us about the pitching award then?
Sure. The pitching award was at age 70, and I was pitching more. I got the Cy Young Award for the best pitcher in camp.
Terrific.
So those were the two awards that I have cherished the most.
Fascinating, fascinating. Now, I've got to ask you, how does the ordinary person who may be sitting in their living room now, watching the show and thinking, gosh, I'd like to get involved in this. How do I start? What are just the initial steps if somebody would like to get involved in Senior League ball?
Well, I think now with the internet, both the Men's Senior Baseball League as well as the Bay Area Senior Baseball League have websites. And they're both well organized. And here in the Bay Area, they have league officers. And on the internet, you can find the email addresses for finding out more information on how to join and what teams are in the localities and so forth.
So could they just go in, for instance, and Google Senior League Baseball, California?
Yes, that would work, as well as they could even do Bay Area's Senior League Baseball or Bay Area's Men's Senior League.
Okay.
And any of those would bring them to a site with the information they're looking for.
Okay. Can you just briefly mention the bad topic of costs involved with Senior League Baseball and Fantasy Ball, just briefly?
Surely. And certainly there's a major advantage in terms of the relative inexpensive nature of the Men's Senior League, particularly when some of the teams have sponsorships.
Yes.
I'm not aware of specific amounts in terms of the variations, which I think can be quite a bit. If you have a sponsor of your Men's Senior League, it's conceivable that there's very little other mandatory expense associated with playing on a team. The trade-off, of course, is you might have to be a good ball player to be considered in the first place. It's much different now with the fantasy camps because there's a very large initial cost for the first fantasy camp that you would attend. These costs can run in excess of $4,000 for a week, and which is very large, and indeed it puts out of reach many other players who would love to play. However, I quickly add that for purposes of the things that occur to the players that become alumni, where you play in these every 6-week tournaments and in Sunday leagues, the cost to do that runs something like $15 to $20 a game, projected over a period of a summer.
Right.
And not only that, all of the equipment, which tends to be major league oriented, and all of those games that are in the Sunday leagues, major league uniforms such as I have on are worn. So you have a kind of a professional atmosphere, even though the players are less. But the cost is significant for the entry fee, so to speak, to get to do this for a lifetime.
So that's something that people certainly need to consider, but it would be a good substitute for a traditional vacation, or people who are thinking about going to Europe or some other country to do this instead and get some good physical activity while doing it instead of just sitting on a plane all the time or a bus. It'd be a nice alternative. I've got to ask you now, as far as you have a good perspective on baseball, and you've seen baseball certainly for several decades, I'd like your opinions on the status of the game today. You might touch briefly on players' salaries, the controversies surrounding drug testing, and how you think the game today, as it's played, compares with the game, let's say, played back in the 1950s or early 60s.
There's a lot of questions and a lot of answers associated with that.
Just in general.
I understand.
Yes.
And I tend to be a moderate on this. I think that certainly salaries are significantly different than they used to be now that we've had free agency. And I kind of liken it, though, to other industries, like the movie industry, for example, where it's a supply and demand business. And to some degree, it's the customer's choice as to how much he pays for a seat. And certainly baseball is still one of the more economical sports to go to when you compare it to the prices that are being charged, for example, for NFL football or professional basketball and so forth. And while I do think some of the player salaries are perhaps out of line, and depending upon how you look at baseball as a sport, I think generally speaking, there's a vast majority of players that are still important in terms of this supply demand. And so I'm not exaggerating the high salaries.
Right.
What I'm worried more about, though, is players no longer have the same allegiance to a home city. And with free agency, we get new ball players in our home city, and we no longer have the 15 or 20-year-old veterans that we love so much from our hometown.
That's a very good point. Growing up in Chicago with the Chicago Cubs, I could predict the infield, on position by position, year after year after year. And I agree with you. Some of that has vanished. Well, on that point, I'll say go Giants. And I want to thank you very much for coming. Our guest today has been Walter Benston, who lives in Cupertino and plays senior league baseball. And Walter, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We hope that you found today's program both informative and interesting. If you would like to suggest a topic or a guest for The Better Part, you can always reach us at the Cupertino Senior Center. The number there is 408-777-3150. You can learn more about us and order a copy of this program or one of the many programs that we've done by visiting our website. The website address is www.thebetterpart.com. The Better Part has many of its programs available through the Santa Clara County Library System. And the Better Part has selected programs also on YouTube. Thanks again for watching. See you next week.